NATO marks its 70th anniversary at a summit just outside London, and despite a show of unity, there was also some tension. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. NATO, the Western military alliance set up after the Second World War to counter the Soviet Union, is marking its 70th anniversary. Leaders from its 29 member states gathered in London this week to discuss major issues confronting the group, including security and the fight against terrorism. NATO's Secretary General stressed the importance of the organization.
NATO remains the only platform where North America and Europe discuss, decide and take actions together every day to protect almost 1 billion people. So whatever our differences, we will continue to unite around our core task, to defend one another, all for one and one for all.
But there were some tensions also on display at the summit, particularly between the United States President Donald Trump and the French President Emmanuel Macron, who clashed on the future of NATO. There's much to discuss, so let's get to our panel. Joining me now from London is Harlan Ullman. He is chairman of the Killowen Group and senior advisor at the Atlantic Council. With me here in the studio is Jean-Bernard Cadier. He is Washington correspondent for the French network BFMTV. From Ankara, we're joined by Yusuf Alabarda. He is a retired officer of the Turkish Armed Forces who served with NATO and is now an expert in international security. Also joining us from Moscow is journalist and political commentator Dmitry Babich. Welcome to all of you. Harlan Ullman, let me start with you. NATO has just turned 70, of course, but it seems to be having a little bit of an identity crisis, trying to figure out exactly what does it stand for, what is its relevance. In fact, Politico magazine here in the United States recently did a piece online which said, is NATO facing an existential crisis? Do you believe it is?
You probably read my column for today asking if NATO is relevant or a relic. Here in London, I think that the summit today was more like a volcano that could have erupted massively, but Donald Trump was more or less restrained, and so there were a few specks of lava that came out. In other terms, it was rather like a crash landing that shook people up, but most of the big issues were really papered over. The fundamental issue that NATO has to confront, in my mind, is that while NATO is a military alliance, the principal challenges from Russia are not military. They're political, they're economic, they're disruptive. And yet NATO is focusing on having everybody spend more money on defense, and it seems to me that NATO is not addressing the principal dangers of how the Russians are politically, economically, and disruptively outmaneuvering us. These were not really raised, and quite frankly, while this was a near crash landing and it was not as disruptive as it might have been, there are lots of fundamental issues that continue to challenge NATO, namely who's in charge. National Security Advisor John Bolton, when he was in the office, said if President Trump gets a second term, America First policies may cause us even further to withdraw from NATO. So at this stage, I would say it's rather like the person who jumped off the Empire State Building and cruising past floor 85 was asked, how's it going? Person said, so far, so good. NATO has huge numbers of problems, and I hope that they address it in a serious manner. Otherwise, it will risk becoming a relic.
Jean-Bernard, what do you make of Harlan Ullman telling us there that the main challenge to NATO right now is political? Is the organization, the alliance, relevant in that respect, or does it have to adapt and change?
From a French point of view, the main threat today is still a security threat, which is terrorism. That's why President Macron insisted on reshaping or rethinking NATO, considering what is threatening Europe today. There is a threat coming from Russia, no question about that, political threat, mingling in European elections. They were mingling in the, meddling in the French elections. But the day-to-day threat, we saw what happened in London last week, is still terrorism. And that's why President Macron wants NATO to be redefined to that extent and think more of what's going on in the south, maybe, than in the east. And that's why the spat occurred, and his interview with The Economist was about what happened in Syria lately.
But there are divisions within NATO, Jean-Bernard. President Emmanuel Macron of France, he was recently very critical of NATO. In fact, he said that the organization, in that article you talk about, was the brain death of the alliance. That prompted a response from the United States President, President Trump, who criticized President Macron for those comments. Let's listen to what President Trump had to say.
It's a tough statement, though, when you make a statement like that. That is a very, very nasty statement to essentially 28, including them, 28 countries. I think that, you know, you have a very high unemployment rate in France. France is not doing well economically at all.
So what do you make of that? How deep are these divisions?
They are quite deep. They are not totally new. They are deep because of what happened in Syria lately. First of all, Emmanuel Macron needed a clash with Donald Trump in London. For domestic reason, he's in trouble in France today. So he needed a clash to show that he is strong against Trump. Above all, considering his first attempt of a bromance with the American president that obviously has not given any results. So he needed the clash.
Yeah.
And it took the reason for the clash, the short-term reason, what happened in Syria, the withdrawal without consulting with allies, which is very bad for an ally. Right. We have troops in Syria, we didn't know what was going on. Mm-hmm. But there is a long-term reason, which we have known since Charles de Gaulle.
What did he mean by
of Europe.
Yeah, what did he mean by calling NATO brain dead?
What about an alliance where you take a strategic decision of withdrawing your troops from a country without consulting, without even notifying your allies? Okay.
Let's go to Ankara in Turkey. Yusuf Alabarda, one of President Macron's biggest criticisms of NATO has to do with Turkey, which is a NATO member. And that criticism points to what Jean-Bernard was just talking about, the fact that Turkey went after Kurdish forces in Syria, and the same Kurdish forces, of course, which have been fighting to defeat ISIL. Let's listen to President Macron and what he had to say.
When I look at Turkey, they now are fighting against those who fight with us, who fought with us, shoulder to shoulder against ISIS. And sometimes they work with ISIS proxies. This is an issue, and this is a strategic issue. If we just have discussion about what we pay, and we don't have clear discussions about such a situation, we are not terrorists.
So, Yusuf, the accusation is that Turkey's actions against the Kurds in Syria has undermined NATO. Has it?
Okay, let's make it clear that Turkish operation to Syria is not against the Kurdish people. Mm-hmm. Let me remind you that from the suppression of Daesh and the YPG, 350,000 Kurdish people now living inside Turkey. So, if we label Turkey is attacking to the Kurdish people, then why 350,000 Kurdish people now lives inside Turkey because of the suppression of the YPG forces? The second issue is that we should act under the umbrella of NATO as a comprehensive approach to all kinds of terrorist activities. Only in the last 2 months, more than 50 Turkish citizens has lost their lives as civilians nearby the border because of the YPG forces attacks. So, Turkish Prime Minister, a couple of years ago, when the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks has been occurred, extended his condolences on the streets of Paris. And he was serious, and he was talking with his heart that he extended his condolences. So, should we name that if people on the streets of the Charlie Hebdo is being killed by the Daesh members, that is terrorist, but if people inside Turkey are being killed by the YPG forces and more than 350,000 Kurdish people expelled to the Turkey, I'm not telling about how many left to the northern part of the Iraq, that shouldn't be considered as a terrorist activity. This is the issue that also Mr. Erdogan wants to clarify, that a holistic approach is very important to fight against terrorism, because when United States was attacked during the September 11, Turkey was the first country declared war against terrorism and act together with the United States and the NATO allies inside Afghanistan.
Dmitry Babich, of course, NATO was set up 70 years ago, a Western defense alliance to counter what was seen as a threat from the Soviet Union, or I should say the Soviet bloc, the Eastern Bloc as it was then known. Well, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO has in fact expanded eastwards, right up to the border with Russia. How is this anniversary being seen in Moscow right now?
Well, it is seen with a lot of sadness because obviously a lot of people, I would say the majority of Russian intellectuals, including liberal intellectuals, pro-Western intellectuals, expected NATO to disappear or to reform itself, to become a political organization, helping the West to face security threats coming from the real dangers, from terrorism, from Islamic fundamentalism, other threats. Instead, as we have just heard, NATO is geared to containing what they call containing Russia. And I challenge you, when we hear these words about threat from Russia, we heard all of these insults towards our president, towards our country from the Western leaders. Angela Merkel said that Putin lived in another world. President Obama said that Russian economy was in tatters because of his sanctions. I challenge you to find a single phrase from our president, from Vladimir Putin, during all of the years that he was in power. I challenge you to find a single insult against a Western leader or a Western country. When we heard now that Russia is interfering in the elections in the United States or in Europe, let me remind you, we heard it from Jean Bernard, let me remind you that Emmanuel Macron was basically an unknown figure just months before the election. So if there was any media operation, it was an operation against François Fillon, who was seen as a friend of Russia and who became a victim of a really nasty media campaign against him. The same story with Germany. When Angela Merkel was doing well in the polls, there was no talk about Russian involvement. When there was a single chance, a small chance that she would lose the election, immediately the German security services started to talk about Russian hacking and all of these phantom threats. As for the divisions inside NATO, I think they should be expected because NATO is seen in Russia as a totalitarian bloc. We have been through a totalitarian period. We know that totalitarians often quarrel with each other. And that's exactly what is going on now inside NATO between American nationalist Donald Trump, French globalist Emmanuel Macron, and the Turkish nationalist Erdogan.
All right, Harlan Ullman, we just
Bernard, could I come in here?
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to come to you. Go ahead.
Let me correct the record. I understand Turkey's issue with terrorism, and I respect that. But NATO is not the correct organization to deal with terrorism for very simple reasons. To deal with terrorism, you need very, very close intelligence and police cooperation. There's always been an issue about sharing highly classified information, even among NATO allies. Now, to the degree that we have information sharing at the police and intelligence levels, that's fine. But NATO inherently is not a counter-terrorist organization, and I don't think it could ever be structured the same, which does not mean that NATO should not be responding to some of these dangers that we face, particularly in cyberspace, and it's trying to do that. About Russia, that's absolute nonsense. It is absolute, let me say this again, it is absolutely incontrovertible that Russia has interfered in our elections. You may want to deny it, that's absolutely true. From a Russian's perspective, I can understand why they wanted to do it and why they want to be disruptive. And let's face it, what has turned the alliance back to worry about Russia was the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the occupation of part of eastern Ukraine. That is what really riled the members of NATO, particularly on the flanks and in Poland. And if there was a way to come to some diplomatic agreement over Ukraine, perhaps with more autonomy in Donbass and the eastern sections, then you would relieve the major irritant that has caused NATO to regard Russia as a major danger. Now, Russia has no intention of moving westward. Putin is not stupid. There are 3 nuclear powers in NATO. NATO spends about 15 times more money on defense, and quite frankly, the Russians do not have the military capacity to launch a world war and think that they could come close to winning. That's not the issue.
Okay.
But if we can move forward on some kind of settlement for Ukraine, that will relieve the major tensions, and then perhaps we can have a better dialogue with Russia.
Okay. Dmitry, what do you make of that? Can there be some movement?
Yeah. Well, that was a very wise response. It's much wiser than the usual responses we hear from the West, so I will try to do my best to explain in our position. You know, on Ukraine, first, NATO decided to expand to Ukraine 6 years before the crisis in 2014.
That's
Back
not
in
true.
2008,
That is
at the
absolutely not
Bucharest
true.
One
summit,
moment, Harlan.
Sorry,
NATO promised.
One moment, Harlan.
Promised Ukraine and Georgia.
No, they did not.
NATO
That's not
promised
true.
Ukraine and Georgia
George
that they
W.
would
Bush-
join the alliance.
Okay, Harlan, one
not in
moment.
the near future.
No, George W. Let me make.
Okay, Harlan, I'll
George
get
W.
to you.
Let
I'll
Holland
get to you,
explain
Harlan.
himself,
Let
but
Dmitry
I can-
finish. Go ahead, Dmitry.
Okay, so Holland may deny it, but in 2008 it was announced that NATO has the intention of one day, they didn't set the date, one day accept Ukraine and Georgia into the membership of NATO. In 2014, before what Holland called the occupation of Crimea, there was a military coup, violent coup in Kiev, in which 38 policemen were killed. To call it a peaceful protest is travesty. So Russia had to respond to the fact that Ukraine was becoming a hostile country, and the response, we know what it was about.
All right,
of
Dmitry,
course, if you read the Western press from the 90s, your own press, you will see that a lot of people in the east of Ukraine disagreed with anti-Russian course of the Ukrainian
All right,
government.
Dmitry, I
Now
want to
let
get...
Holland
all right.
explain what happened in 2008 in Bucharest.
Right, I want to get a very quick response from Harlan. Harlan, a quick response, and then I want to move on. Go ahead.
I was at Bucharest during the 2008 summit. Both Ukraine and Georgia did not get membership action plan, and George W. Bush, in a sweeping gesture, said, of course, NATO will recognize Ukraine and Georgia sometime in the future. Putin was there. Putin was furious, and rightly so.
Okay.
And what
Not
happened was he
recognized, but
set a trap
recognized
in
as NATO
Georgia.
member.
Okay, all right, gentlemen, we have to move on. Jean-Bernard, a big issue in NATO, the cost that each country pays. President Trump has been very critical of NATO, saying that some members have not met their threshold, the threshold of the money they ought to spend. This is what President Trump had to say. Let's watch.
NATO is becoming different than it was, much bigger than it was, and much stronger than it was because people are now fulfilling their commitments. There are some countries that aren't fulfilling their commitment, and those countries are going to be dealt with. Maybe I'll deal with them from a trade standpoint. Maybe I'll deal with them in a different way.
What do you make of that? And does that put a question mark over the U.S. commitment to NATO?
There is real concern about what each and every country in Europe does or does not do to help NATO. That's a real concern, and especially from the point of view of Germany. In that respect, I think President Trump is right. Where there's another subject of concern from what we just heard from him is mixing trade with the security, threatening to retaliate on trade what he cannot get on the security contribution. This is, I think, a very dangerous path.
Yusuf Alabarda, there's also been some controversy, also some questions asked about the Turkish decision, Turkey, of course, a member of NATO, the Turkish decision to buy weapons from Russia. Are these concerns valid among other NATO members, seeing that Turkey is buying weapons for what was perceived as a threat to NATO?
Okay, this is a very nice question to be answered. Turkey has a soft spot in the air defense system, and for this reason, Turkey made many requests to the United States in order to buy Patriot missile defense system in order to close the gap at the air defense system. But the Congress, as Mr. Trump said for many times, didn't allow the United States to sell those weapons to Turkey. So whenever there's a problem in between Turkey and Germany, Turkey and Holland, they pull back their Patriot missile batteries outside of Turkey. That means that Turkey stayed with a soft spot, which there is no air defense system inside the country. And Turkey cannot buy it from their allies, such as in the case of the United States. For this reason, Turkey decided to buy the S-400 systems in order to close the gap from the air defense system. And also, President Macron clearly stated yesterday that S-400 systems cannot be explained as a member of the NATO. But did really Mr. Macron wonder that the Greece has bought S-300 systems 15 years ago, and so far no one has asked to Greece why they bought S-300 and they adapted it to the NATO systems? For this reason, in the regulation of the NATO, there is no regulation that confines Turkey not to buy any Russian-made weapon system. For this reason, if we understand the root causes, Turkey is forced to buy a Russian-made S-400 system. The other issue that my friend a couple of minutes ago said that NATO is not fight against terrorism, but let me say that there is a transformation center at the HQ of the NATO, and one of the biggest threats that the NATO country is now perceiving is the fight against terrorism. If NATO is not fighting against terrorism, it is an organization for the conventional warfare, then why Article 5 has been worked after the September 11 attacks? Turkey, including the United States, fought against all kinds of terrorist activities inside Afghanistan. If we say that NATO is not for fighting against terrorism, then we didn't understand what's going on after the end of the Cold War. The NATO is facing, it is in its history now, the biggest challenge is terrorism, migration, lots of issues other than the conventional warfare. The S-400 system, as I
could I make a comment?
Yes,
is
sure,
the
I'll get you.
end result that Turkey is forced.
Okay, Harlan, go ahead.
I'd like to make 2 points. From the American perspective, we've been demanding almost since the inception of NATO for the Allies to spend more. I think that this is a false issue. As I said, NATO spends 15 times more on defense. If national countries want to spend more, they enhance their own capacity, but they do very little to enhance NATO's capacity because of the issues of interoperability. So how much we spend, I think, is far less relevant than what we spend it on. In terms of the other issues that we're facing here, look, NATO is something that really cannot respond to terrorism. Yes, it does have a great center, and we can exchange information. But quite frankly, I think the Allies made a mistake on September 12th, declaring Article 5 to go into Afghanistan, because that ceased being a war against terror, and it became a war to try to develop Afghanistan into a Western democracy, which unfortunately has not worked out well.
Hasn't that been a problem in the United States?
I would like to remind you that NATO has excellent centers fighting for terrorism. NATO has excellent centers for fighting terrorism. So, but that is functional. So if you say that NATO is not for fighting against terrorism, then what is the meaning of that? This transformation, NATO has rapid deployment forces in order to fight against terrorism, and it has excellent centers which is deployed inside Turkey.
What I'm saying is that NATO is not necessarily the organization where it can really deal with terrorism. It can be integrative, it can be cooperative, but the main mission, as we saw in Afghanistan, if it's going to be fighting terrorism, is not going to work.
All right, Jean-Bernard, not everyone, not all leaders are critical of NATO. We heard from the British leader, Boris Johnson. This is what he had to say about NATO. Let's watch.
The fact that we live in peace today demonstrates the power of the simple proposition at the heart of this alliance, that for as long as we stand together, no one can hope to defeat us, and therefore no one will start a war.
Does he have a point there?
Yes, absolutely. The very good surprise was President Trump's behavior or attitude towards NATO, because we heard him in the past saying and stating that NATO was obsolete, too costly, and for him there was no real reason to keep NATO the way it is now. And the good surprise in London, for some reason, he discovered another truth, and Donald Trump season 2 is much more oriented towards NATO, which is great news. It might have to do with the fact that Donald Trump is a businessman, and that NATO means always arms sales, and he realized that it's not just a fantasy of European politicians.
Okay. Dmitry Babich, the NATO Secretary General, is holding out the hope that NATO would be open to some kind of meaningful dialogue with Russia. But we see the INF Treaty, that's now dead. We also see these rising tensions over Ukraine. So how do you see this NATO-Russia relationship move forward?
I think it will all depend on the West, because on the Russian side you have all the goodwill. The Russian elite is not anti-Western. You know, President Putin and others, they still organize these costly economic summits with European and American business leaders, all at our expense. All the sanctions were not a Russian initiative. They were all an initiative of the United States and the European Union. As for the threat, you know, I would like to correct Holland a little bit. NATO is 18 times bigger than Russia militarily. I mean, the American budget is 14 times bigger than the Russian military budget. And in Europe, according to Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, Russia's military expenses are 27% of the expenses of NATO's European allies. So Boris Johnson is absolutely right when he says no one will attack us. But why is there so much military jingoistic rhetoric coming from the West now? Why is the danger of war now, I think, is much bigger than during the times of the Cold War? It was not Russia's fault. It's the West that changed since 1991. Russia changed for the better. The West changed for the worse. Look, the wars in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in all of them, the West was the initiator. You know, the initiative came from the West. You know, the idea of regime change has become a major catalyst for military conflict in today's world. So, if Boris Johnson is serious about keeping peace, he should look inward. He should look at NATO and see how many wars NATO and Europe have participated in during the last 25, 30 years, since the Gulf War at least.
Right, Jean-Bernard, you want to say something?
Yes, to Dmitry, speaking of war, there is a war going on in Donbass now, and there is a very good practical exercise to see what the goodwill of each party is when they meet on December 9th in Paris. There will be a meeting in Paris with President Putin, with President Zelensky of Ukraine, with Chancellor Merkel, and with President Macron of France about Ukraine. And this is a very good practical exercise to see who is guilty or not guilty, has goodwill or no goodwill towards peace on our continent.
Harlan, very quickly, one final point, Harlan. Will we still have...
Two issue. Boris Johnson is being a statesman. Not only does he have an election, but he sees the lack of leadership in NATO, and he's trying to aspire to that.
I've just got 30 seconds, Harlan. Will NATO still be there in another 70 years?
No.
All right. Very simple, very easy. Do you agree?
I'm afraid that's the truth.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.